Embracing Uncertainty, What Kenyan Herdsmen Can Teach Us About Living in a Volatile World. This is by Samuel Derbyshire, Junior Research Fellow, Anthropology, University of Oxford, on the conversation. Laura Ekale sits down on his carved wooden stool. He sips a cup of black instant coffee, a substance he has taken to calling his medicine. Inexplicably, he claims it helps him fall asleep. And that happens to me too. I drink hot coffee, and it's the hot drink, I think. Anyway, he says, I have been making it for him each afternoon with my small gas cooker. This has become a routine for us. He roams over to my canvas tent as the sun begins to set and I boil the kettle. We sit there talking about the day as one of his sons, Lolompa, wanders in from the hills behind us, driving the family's sheep and goats back into their closure. I have known Laura for almost 2 years now, during which time I have regularly set up my research camp beside his family home, close to the Loriu Hills in Turkana, northern Kenya. This 68,000 square kilometer arid region is one of the most remote areas in Kenya. To the north is South Sudan and the disputed lawless section of grazing land called the Ilemi Triangle, claimed by both South Sudan and Kenya. To the west is the homeland of Karamojong in northern Uganda, and to the east is Lake Turkana itself, the world's largest permanent desert lake. The Turkana region is southern boundary. The southern boundary is the only one connecting it with the rest of Kenya on land, a fact that has led its population to endure a long history of socioeconomic and political marginalization, spanning both the colonial and post-colonial periods. Its popularity is largely comprised of highly mobile pastoralists, herdsmen that is, communities who rely on herds of domesticated livestock, which they graze on communal open-range lands. Laura has 2 wives and 10 children. My research into how people forge their livelihoods in this harsh and unpredictable region has been greatly influenced by his insight. Like most people here, one of his foremost concerns is the weather. Whenever clouds form overhead, they must be scrutinized carefully and discussed. Meanwhile, prominent seers in nearby villages offer their predictions about when the next downpour will come. Rain has always been unpredictable in this place. The whole of northern Kenya has seen widespread and recurrent droughts since beyond living memory. But in recent decades, climate change has intensified this unpredictability. Vegetation that is diminished and more sparsely scattered than ever before must now support the livestock of a population that has grown rapidly over the last 50 years. Such acute resource scarcity sustains long-standing inter-ethnic conflicts. Laura and his first wife, Nakwiru, migrated to their current location 10 years ago, fleeing from an area close to an administrative and ethnic border dividing the Turkana from their southern pastoralist neighborhoods, the Pokot. Sometimes, in our daily conversation, Laura tells me how difficult things were back there, and now and then he's visited by old friends and family members who travel up from the border to see him. They sit outside my tent with their Kalashnikovs slung over their shoulders, propped up against their thighs, telling stories about violent skirmishes and cattle raids. I make them coffee too, and they're good-humored for the most part. One would be forgiven for assuming that increased pressure on the already scant resources, conflict around territorial boundaries, and scanter, less predictable rainfall are the extent of northwestern Kenya's troubles, but this is not the case. Other forms of ecological degradation, largely caused by external activities, threaten major water sources. The Kerio, one of only 2 major rivers in Turkana, has suffered catastrophically in recent years. Heightened irrigation activity upstream and the haphazard introduction of an invasive, deep-rooted kind of mosquito, a shrub native to Mexico, South America, and the Caribbean, by NGOs in the early 1980s now mean that it is often dry for several years at a time. It used to flood every year. Lake Turkana itself is threatened by damming activity and Ethiopia along its major water source, the Omo River. Uncertainty. Standing back and looking at this conglomeration of troubles, it's hard not to feel despondent. As with many other historically marginalized parts of Africa, the stories about Turkana that make it into the mainstream media tend to be coached in the language of crisis and disaster. Perhaps it does not help that its only representation is a feature film was in the popular adaptation of John le Carre's The Constant Gardener, where it was the wild, lawless setting for a brutal assassination. Some may argue that negativity about Africa's pastoralist homelands is warranted, but others have suggested that such a focus has brought forth inappropriate responses from the development sector. Over the years, this perception of crisis and turbulence has provoked solutions that have sought to impose new forms of uniformity, order, and stability, many of which have met with calamitous failure. Recently, researchers have begun to emphasize the need to stop fixating on the uncertainty itself and instead to look beyond it, that is, to base development efforts on the ways people are already managing it. Independent organizations such as the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, have argued that a more prosperous future can only be achieved by supporting what communities in Africa's drylands are already doing to exploit the changing and unpredictable resources around them. The research my team and I have undertaken over the last few years has supported this argument with the new case studies from Turkana, exploring changing patterns of movement and the transforming relationship between cultivators and specialized herders. Meanwhile, a research program at the University of Sussex has gone a step further, arguing that pastoralists' adaptations contain unexplored connections with other, perhaps more familiar domains and sectors that are uncertain. For example, financial and commodity systems, critical infrastructure management, disease outbreak responses, migration policy, climate change, and conflict and security governance, to name but a few. Developed countries, they argue, may have a lot to learn from those forging their livelihoods in ecologically and politically volatile contexts. Knowing Laura's past, it's difficult to disagree with this thinking. His life story is a playbook for how to thrive in unpredictable circumstances. Study it carefully enough and you'll yield important lessons, whatever challenge you may be facing. But the ingenuity and skill of the Turkana has rarely been recognized. In fact, in many instances, their responses to moments of crisis have directly contradicted the interventions of large-scale development programs. The Turkana Rehabilitation Project. In the early 1980s, following a severe drought, a famine took hold across Turkana. In response, a collaboration emerged between the Kenyan government and the European Economic Community, which set about settling people into so-called famine camps, quote unquote. The scheme was called the Turkana Rehabilitation Project. It was a success at first, alleviating mass starvation and radically reducing associated deaths, but it began to struggle when it sought to instigate its second objective, a 5-year land rehabilitation plan, encouraging mobile herders to settle permanently into sedentary riverside agricultural schemes. This, they envisaged, was a more sustainable, stable way of getting along. While researching this scheme for my recent book about the region, I was often told by my interviewees that it was doomed as soon as the local population figured out what it was trying to achieve. For a society fundamentally disposed to hedging its bets, the idea of whole families settling permanently in one place to farm riverside plots appeared both nonsensical and dangerous to them. It was not that farming itself was seen as worthless. On the contrary, farming has always been important in the regional economy, but it has always been just one piece of the larger jigsaw of flexible livelihoods. In early 2015, I spent several days talking about this with Emery Lowassa, the head of a large and influential family in the southern Turkana. From her farmland on the edge of the Kerio River, now strangled by the invasive mosquito introduced in the 1980s, She told me about a time where there were no kiosks, no markets, and no roads. It was then, she recalled, that she and her family were regularly trading the sorghum, a cereal grain, they grew by the river, to visiting herdsmen for livestock and milk. Emery's family and their wider social network have always been spread across many different livelihoods. During times of abundance, their different livelihoods complemented each other, livestock being exchanged for grain. During times of scarcity, her family members survived by turning to whatever in their repertoire of activities is still tenable. Unsurprisingly, perhaps most of the people who had been settled into the Turkana Rehabilitation Project's famine camps merely exploited the nutritional security that relief food handouts provided to grow their dwindling herds. When climatic conditions shifted once more, they departed the camps altogether to return to a semi-nomadic life. This dynamism is simply what's necessary in a place that has never offered predictability or uniformity. Uncertainty must be embraced, harnessed for the better. Stability never lasts long, and if you invest everything in it, you're sure to meet with catastrophe. Even for those involved in the most specialized, highly mobile forms of herding, extreme variability in rain and vegetation has never been an insurmountable threat. In fact, their livelihood allows them to be as productive as is humanly possible in a place with such uncertain ecological characteristics. By carefully managing rates of consumption in their livestock, herders like Laura are able to take the most of scarce and changing vegetation. The size and constitution of this herd also changes over time in tune with prevailing conditions, allowing him and his family to endure over the long term, weathering radical environmental shifts. The knowledge that makes all this possible is highly complex. Fragility. Of course, societies across the developed world are not going to abandon industry and commerce to take up semi-nomadic pastoralism anytime soon, but this is not the point. The point is that whether you like it or not, many in the West are now charged with the task of remaining productive during a period of environmental, political, and economic turbulence that seems more pronounced than ever before. So why not look at Turkana for some guidance? It's not difficult to find starting points. Laura's careful management of his herd consumption to maximize the nutritional value of scant resources resonates with the broader challenge of living more sustainably in the face of climate change. Likewise, many of us would benefit from learning how to be more open, both physically and psychologically, to radical shifts in routine. Now, to the statistician, essayist, and former options trader Nassim Nicholas Taleb, this requires us to think more carefully about what the opposite end of the fragility spectrum really is. He argues it's not resilience or robustness, not the weathering of uncertainty by blocking it out and shielding interior forms of stability and uniformity. The antithesis of fragility is actually something called anti-fragility, that is, the ability to actively gain from disorder and to get stronger by means of random shocks and not despise them. Taleb explains his concept through multiple case studies, ranging from 2008 financial crisis to biological processes like evolution. Even information itself, he says, is anti-fragile because it feeds more on attempts to harm it than it does on efforts to promote it. The idea of anti-fragility provokes new questions of places like Turkana, where time and again internationally funded interventions aimed to fixing various perceived economic and social issues have simply instigated forms of fragile, short-term stability that have collapsed into failure at the first sign of trouble. The Turkana Rehabilitation Project was by no means an anomaly. The NORAD scheme, 1970, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD, began work in the region to develop a commercial fishing industry, the history of which I explore in a recent article. NORAD spent over $2 million building, that's over 14 million today's money, building a monumental fish drying and freezing facility beside Ferguson Gulf, a sleepy cluster of fishing villages on the western shore of Lake Turkana. And within a few years, though, the building had all been abandoned and bolted shut. With fluctuations in the economy, the freezing of lake fish had proven financially impracticable at an off-the-grid location, the overly complex system put in place by the schema to facilitate movement of fish from lakeside villages to the factory and then on to markets was insufficient and prone to corruption. The final nail in the coffin came in the form of a drought to the northeast, which desiccated the Omo River and caused Lake Turkana's level to recede drastically. Ferguson Gulf dried out and its fishery collapsed. And once again, the scheme that had aimed to achieve prosperity by means of systemic rigidity and uniformity was undone by the uncertain context in which it was established. Looking back, it's easy to cast aspirations on developmental failures. They are rendered simpler and more obvious by hindsight. It's not true to say that international aid and development in general have been pointless in Turkana. The Turkana Rehabilitation Project no doubt saved thousands from starvation through the simple distribution of relief food. The NORAD scheme saw huge and much needed investments in regional infrastructure and the allocation of vital fishing equipment. In both instances, the problem was not the decision to intervene in the first place, nor was it necessarily the form or scale of material investment. It was arguably the assumption that the solution to the troubles at hand lay in overhauling previously upended livelihoods and trying to stabilize them. In the end, both interventions came to be co-opted through their insertion into much more varied and flexible long-term strategies. The Turkana project became a pathway back into a dynamic, semi-nomadic form of pastoralism, and after NORAD's scheme initial failure, the equipment and infrastructure left behind were used by participating communities to advance a more adaptive, malleable fishing industry. Today, the great factory at Kalokol lies empty, while bundles of dried fish are traded a stone's throw from its closed gates to businessmen and entrepreneurs who travel to northern Kenya from far and wide. Over the years, they're moved in and out following the lake shore's fluctuations. If there's a slump in demand or restrictions on supply, the fishing communities suspend their commerce and make do by subsisting on lake's resources. And this industry is not perfect, but it's strong, and it's strong because, like the world in which it operates, it is unpredictable. Embracing volatility. Fortunately, the sector has largely moved from this kind of large-scale, technocratic, externally planned interventions that predominated in the 1970s and 80s, but one cannot help wonder whether development in Africa is still, broadly speaking, underpinned by Western preoccupation with battling uncertainty by means of stability, with establishing new forms of predictability that are ultimately doomed to failure. Perhaps it's time to question whether such a mindset is going to be the best way of supporting those making a living at the margins as they face a future that promises more volatility than ever before. Back in 2015, Emery Lowassa explained to me that when the river Kerio's flood cycle began to degenerate, seasonal farmers like her found themselves at a loose end. In the space of a few short years, they had gone from regularly exchanging their excess sorghum with friends and family members in the herding sector to being unable to plant their riverside plots altogether. This was a critical threat to their livelihood, but it was also nutritionally detrimental to the visiting herders whose diets had been regularly supplemented by grains provided by the riverside communities. It was a moment of crisis. The solution, Emery said, was not to be found in doubling down and trying to make things work despite the circumstances. It lay in radically rethinking what the cultivating herding relationship consisted of in the first place and transforming how it operated. Her family and wider community took advantage of a gradually improving national infrastructure to begin importing grains from further afield. Many of them became tradespeople, and instead of their own crops, they sold sacks of maize, millet, beans, and other foodstuffs to herders who capitalized on burgeoning riverside settlements to establish cash markets for their livestock. The farmers also made mats and baskets from palm trees that grew along the river. Whatever they could not sell to the new markets, they sent off to the nearest urban centers where women's groups sold them to customers traveling south into the rest of Kenya. They embraced the very volatility that threatened catastrophe, gaining from the disorder by making something new with the remnants of what came before. And today, farmers along the Kerio still provide grain to herders out on the plains, even if this grain no longer regularly grown on their riverside plots. Herders still distribute livestock into their riverside populations, these days via cash markets rather than seasonal exchanges, and the relationship endures. Indeed, it grows stronger because it has welcomed disorder in it to reshape it. And this is from The Conversation. What's going on in Africa is totally different than what's going on in the developed Western world. Amazing differences. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.